Chapter 9. Miss Grant advises Hilda. 2 days passed, and Crystal did not see Hebe again, or rather did not see her to speak to. Once from a distance, she glimpsed her returning from a walk with her friend Bianca Fontana. Crystal, still lonely and missing Agnes's companionship, had been blueberrying in the pastures belonging to Dr. Grant. The pastures lay the other side of the red house, away from the village. Perhaps it was their proximity to the red house that decided Crystal to spend the afternoon there, even if she had to spend it alone. She was kneeling, adding a few last berries to her already well-rounded pail, when voices came to her from a distance. At least a voice came to her, but there were 2 people. She saw them when she stood up, straightening her back. Away at the other side of the pasture, Hebe and Bianca Fontana were passing toward the red house, both carrying pails. So they had been berrying too. Hebe was wearing her wide hat and walking with her peculiar rhythmical grace. Bianca, even from that distance, was a decided contrast. Hers was an ambling gait, rather stiff and weary, but it was her voice that Crystal had heard. Hebe was keeping her accustomed silence, the most companionable silence in the world. Crystal knew it to be. Crystal stood watching them, shading her eyes with her hand. It did not occur to her to call and wave, glad as she was to see Hebe. How lucky Bianca was! But she had been Hebe's friend for years probably, and possibly took her luck for granted. No, Crystal doubted that. Nobody, not even that somber Italian woman, could take Hebe's friendship and Hebe's companionship for granted. Only what a queer friend Bianca was for Hebe. Hebe was so young, and Bianca was so old. She might be 40, Bianca, and she was bony and angular and awkward, and she was so somber. How had Hebe's lightness ever matched itself for friendship with Bianca Fontana's heaviness? Crystal wished with all her heart that Hebe would see her and wave, but Hebe did not turn her head. She was giving her complete attention to Bianca's Italian. Still, the minute had made Crystal rich. It was wonderful to have seen Hebe at all, up here, where she had not expected to, even if there was no exchange of greetings. She stood watching them out of sight, under the curve of her hand, Bianca's voice growing thinner and thinner on the air. The next day was the hottest of that summer. Selina, guessing that it was to be a scorcher, was up very early in order to get the housework done while effort was still possible. Crystal was down not far behind her and stood by loyally, making beds, dusting, washing dishes. All the shutters of Tinkle Bell's windows were closed and the curtains drawn, for Selina minded the heat and knew how to keep a house cool. By 10 o'clock she was able to sit down in the parlor, the coolest room, with some sewing. There Crystal left her to go to the post office for the 10 o'clock mail. Crystal liked the heat and throve in it. She neglected even to wear a shade hat now. As always, The post office was full of summer people, eager for their mail, curiously standing on tiptoes to peer into their boxes, while the letters were being sorted behind the closed window, crowding a little, each one bound to keep his place and get his mail squarely in his turn. The villagers themselves did not care so much for their letters as for the spectacle of the summer folk, or perhaps their chances of interesting mail were so much slimmer that it was not worth their while to keep their places. Whatever the reason, the men of the village lined up on the piazza railing outside, or sat on the long bench there against the wall, and the village women chatted together in the doorway and back in the corner behind the pickle barrel, never losing their interest, however, in the close group of summer people about the tight-shut little box of a delivery window. And there today, Crystal came face to face with Agnes and Hilda. She did not become aware of them until she was almost halfway through the store, when it was too late to turn back. But the embarrassment she had dreaded in such a meeting had no time to develop. The minute they saw her, they hurried toward her, giving up their position at the window. "We were on our way to Tinklebell," Agnes said, grabbing her by the arm. "We were going to get your mail first, along with ours, but it's late today, not worth waiting for." Hilda nodded. She said point blank, "I say, Crystal, I've wanted to see you to apologize, but we've been doing so many things. You know, I was an idiot that day you came. The berries were lovely. I wrote you a note, but that's not my line. Had to tear it up." "It's all right," Crystal said quickly. "I understood." "What do you think, Crystal? News for you." Agnes lowered her voice. "Paul's going to put on a play. Romeo and Juliet. We're getting people to say they'll try out. He said to ask you the very first one." Crystal looked at Hilda. "Your brother's going to do it. Romeo and Juliet. When? Where? How?" She was almost shivering in spite of the heat. "Yes," Agnes answered instead of Hilda. "He's a shark at that sort of thing, Paul. And Hilda's going to stage manage all the mechanical end, electric lights, and everything. Up at the Red House. She's even going to make a water curtain." Crystal was as impressed as Agnes wanted her to be. "What is a water curtain?" she asked. "Oh, you'll see." Hilda spoke nonchalantly. "It's quite a stunt, though, and lots of fun. Last year in Los Angeles, we did Midsummer Night's Dream in the same way. I had full charge of the stage. Paul did nothing about that. Our water curtain was 15 feet high, but here I can get it even higher, I think. You will help us and try out for a part, won't you? Paul specially wanted you asked first." The girls were talking in whispers, very close together. "What part will you try for?" Agnes asked Crystal. "Juliet?" Crystal nodded. Both Hilda and Agnes laughed. "I'm going to try for Juliet too," Agnes explained. Their mirth. "And Paul says every single girl will want it and expect to get it. He's going to be very professional and give it to the one who's best, though. No favoritism. But if we aren't best, Crystal, we'll stay just the same and try for something else, won't we? We'll surely fit into something, and someone's got to do small parts, of course. It sounded like Miss Grant speaking. Mother says Paul's strongest forte is casting, Hilda explained. He fits just the right people into the right parts, without any bother. He's not apt to make mistakes. Crystal looked at Hilda. How casually she spoke of her mother, just as though she were any mother. With the same casualness, Crystal herself might mention Selina. Let's come back for the mail later, Agnes suggested, and go over to my house and get some iced lemonade or something now. She linked one arm in Hilda's and one in Crystal's, drawing them toward the door. It's ages since I've seen you, Crystal. We can get acquainted again. The Grants lived in a big white colonial house on Main Street, directly across from the historical town pump. The house was surrounded by green lawns, shaded by elms and maples, and there was a profusion of formal flower beds. Dr. Grant had built the house on the site of a very old one with the same lines 15 years before, when he had to give up his hospital work in New York, where he was recognized as a coming big surgeon, and retire for his health to Fairfleet and a country practice. He had plenty of money, independent of his earnings, and by the time his health had been restored to the point where it would be safe to take up the threads of his dropped career, he had no desire to go back. He preferred to live on in Fairfleet, where he had made a place for himself in the life of the people and felt really needed. So the house was one unusually imposing for that of a country doctor. Inside, this morning, it seemed deserted. Not even a maid was visible, moving with the quiet unobtrusion that Miss Grant demanded in her servants. The high, big rooms were as still as vaults. The girls passed Dr. Grant's office on tiptoe. Outside of his large practice, he was doing some research work, and if he was in there now, he must not be disturbed. In the dining room, the long dining table stood bare, reflecting on its surface, polished to ebony, the garden flowers that stood as though they were growing in grass in the shallow black bowl at its center. Agnes took a silver tray from the dresser, and Hilda brought goblets from the china closet. Hilda seemed very much at home here in the doctor's house. Crystal reflected. Agnes went away through the swinging door into the kitchen, but she was back almost at once with a pitcher of ice-cold ginger ale and grape juice. The doctor didn't allow his family to use ice in drinks, but the mixture had been standing on ice all morning and was sparklingly cold. Hilda perched on one end of the dining table, swinging her legs. Agnes sat on the other end, rather in imitation. Crystal couldn't help thinking. Miss Grant certainly wouldn't like it. Crystal herself was in the doctor's armchair at the head of the table. It was pleasant to be back again, after many days of loneliness and doubt about Agnes, and it was almost exactly as though nothing had gone wrong between them. Of course, nothing had gone wrong that one could put one's finger on, nothing but an unusual silence. "Will your mother come to see the play?" Cristel asked of Hilda, her face paling as she asked it. Hilda's frank boyishness was suddenly shadowed. She looked away. "I don't think so," she said, and then added, after an instant, in a different tone, and looking at Cristel again with her frank blue eyes, "But father will, perhaps." "That's funny," Cristel explained. "I never thought about your father, but you must have one. And Paul did tell me. I'd forgotten." Hilda laughed. "You bet I have a father. He's Claude Gildersleeve, dramaturge. But he says himself he'll never get his just deserts as long as mother's acting. He discovered her, you know, and gave her her chance. He was just beginning to get famous himself as a producer. But mother made such a hit. This was years ago, you know, that right then and there father's doom was sealed. That's what he always says. Gildersleeve means the actress to people now, and they forget what's behind the actress. The man who puts the plays on and shows the actress how to act and everything." "My mother doesn't forget," Agnes said. "She knew all about your father, Hilda, Claude Gildersleeve. She told us this very morning at breakfast how much he'd done for the stage and the movies too. She said he'd started all the new movement in pictures." "She did." Hilda seemed pleased. "Good for her." But Cristel had paled again. Why, oh why, couldn't she manage to keep calmer and control the foolish hammering of her heart? Why did she have to feel things like this? She was shaken, just as though she had an engine inside her that was too powerful for its instrument, her body, and her voice sounded to her ears as though it were speaking from the other side of the room, not out of her own throat. "Your father's a producer," the voice was saying, "and he's coming to see Romeo and Juliet if we do it. He'll see us act." Hilda nodded. Agnes laughed. "I should think you'd know all about Claude Gildersleeve," she exclaimed teasingly. "You'd better study up a little, Cristel, if you're going on the stage." "Talking about the play. Good. It's a splendid thing for you young people to occupy yourselves with this summer." Miss Grant had come so softly through the hall that they had not been aware of her approach. She was in her white hat with its fluttering veil, and just removing her gloves. "I'm back from a drive with Miss Coldwater," she told everyone present. "Do get me a drink, Agnes. I'm so thirsty." Miss Grant had brought the scent of violets into the room with her. It breathed from her scarf and from the white veil. She joined the girls at the table, laying her bare arms out on its cool surface and clasping her hands. Hilda had slipped into a chair, and Agnes was bringing a goblet. "Who is Miss Coldwater?" Hilda asked with interest. "We've had an invitation to lunch with her. It came in yesterday's mail. Is Blue Diamond the name of an estate? It sounds more like a mine." "You are fortunate," with an invitation from her. Accept it, my dear. Miss Grant spoke to Hilda seriously. Blue Diamond is an estate. It is named from a lake that is a peculiar blue. The first time Miss Coldwater saw it, she said, "It's like a blue diamond," and she named it on the spot. But who is she, and why does she invite us, Paul and me, to lunch? Well, originally she's Bostonian, but she has lived so much abroad and known so many distinguished Europeans that she always seems to be more of a European than an American. She has a place in Scotland, a castle, and a villa in Florence, and so on. She's really something of a figure. She is usually called Madame Coldwater, for no reason at all, except that Miss seems too ordinary for such a personage. And it's very nice that she's asked you and Paul to lunch. She did it on your mother's account, of course. Yes, but why? Are there any young people there? A grandson is visiting her, as it happens. He's quite a bit older than you, though 21, I think. He wants to be a painter, and his father, who is a portrait painter, thinks he has genius, but his grandmother doesn't. She hates the things he does. They are too modern for her taste. What do you think about his pictures, Crystal? She had turned on Crystal with disconcerting suddenness. I don't know. They're awfully queer, Crystal answered, but I don't know anything about painting. Miss Grant looked at Crystal silently, waiting for more, but when Crystal did not volunteer more, she asked, impetuously, "My dear child, when did you ever see his work?" Crystal remembered her agreement with Selina to keep the painting of the portrait up on the view to themselves, so she answered now, with embarrassment and vagueness, "The other day. He showed some pictures to me." "But is that young man the only one? Isn't there anyone younger?" Hilda was not aware of the contest going on between Crystal's reticence and Miss Grant's curiosity. "No one younger, probably, but you will find any number of other people. As long as Miss Coldwater stays at Blue Diamond, there is almost certain to be an interesting house full. When are you lunching with her? She asked us for Friday, but she sounds rather terrifying. Your mother would want you to accept, I am sure, and of course it is well to do it promptly. Madame Coldwater has never relaxed in her insistence on etiquette. She is not with our modern ideas there." Hilda sighed. "Oh, bother," she said. Miss Grant turned her attention to Crystal again. Yesterday she had learned nothing at Tingle Bell to explain why Alexander Coldwater had come to be calling there, or at least Selina's careless, "Oh, Crystal picked him up somewhere, and then he came calling," told her nothing, and today she had asked Madame Coldwater on their drive whether Alexander knew the Barker girls well. Madame Coldwater's reply had startled Miss Grant. It was so certain, and at the same time so brusque. "He doesn't know them at all. Never even heard of them." "Oh, but I saw him there yesterday, calling," Miss Grant had answered that. Yet that was the end of it. Madame Coldwater had shown neither surprise nor displeasure at the unexpected information. Yes, was all she said, and turned the talk in another direction. But there was something. Miss Grant was sure there was something in all this that was very queer. There had been a reason for Madame Coldwater's neglecting to include the Barker girls in the general invitation to her party. Miss Grant was more certain of that than ever now. "How is Selina today? What is she doing?" Miss Grant asked, her attention still entirely centered on Crystal. "She's very well," Crystal replied, and added, "Thank you. She was at home when I left, sitting like a mermaid at the bottom of the sea. Only she wasn't combing her hair. She was hemming curtains for the guest room." "Why a mermaid?" Hilda inquired. "Because she had closed the green shutters, and the door, and the house now is all in a lovely green light. Sometimes, when it's like that, I pretend it's the inside of a pea pod, and Selina is the fairy of the peas. But today, because of the heat, it's more like the sea. There are sort of waves in the air, and of course Selina would make a perfect mermaid." Hilda laughed. "You make me think of Hebe," she exclaimed. "That sounded just like her." "Hebe? Who's that?" Miss Grant had really forgotten. Hilda looked dismayed for an instant. Then she said casually, but with an expression in her averted eyes that did not look a bit casual, "She's someone visiting Bianca, our housekeeper. Crystal somehow reminds me of her." Miss Grant looked at Crystal quizzically. "Oh, of course. She's the person to whom you gave your larkspurs. You are democratic in your choice of friends, my dear. First, the housekeeper's friend, and then Alexander Coldwater. Why did you give her the flowers? I am frankly curious." Hilda allowed Crystal no chance to answer this. "Hebe's all right," she said quickly, "and I think it's splendid in Crystal giving her the larkspurs. It pleased her, I can tell you." "Of course it pleased her, and of course Hebe's all right." Miss Grant laid a gentle hand on Hilda's wrist. "Your mother would hardly allow a person who wasn't all right to be visiting the servants, especially when she's not here to have an oversight herself. Good morning." Like Miss Grant, Dr. Grant had come so softly down the hall that they had not heard him. "What sort of a council is this? Are you planning the picnic?" "A picnic? That listens better than a luncheon with the great and noble Madame Coldwater, anyway." "When? Where?" Hilda jumped up to welcome him. Evidently they were on the best of terms already, the doctor and Hilda. In vain Miss Grant subtly signaled her husband to delay his revelations for a future date. He did not notice. "Yes, a picnic to Hunter's Beach. I've offered my car, so you can all go. Miss Grant has planned it in great detail. She is thinking of inviting a boy for Paul, an ornithologist, too. Have you heard about it, Crystal?" No, Crystal hadn't heard, and for a very good reason. Miss Grant had decided that there would not be room for her in the car. But of course, Dr. Grant had forgotten that. Miss Grant was provoked, but concealed it. "It's to be Monday," she replied to their delighted questions. "If it's a nice day. The surf is remarkable at Hunter's Beach. It's just the place for an all-day excursion. But let us talk about the play now. I do believe I am more thrilled than you young people are with the idea. You must let me help a lot with the costumes. Designing and making, you know. I'm rather strong on costumes. In college, I was president of the Dramatic Association and amateur theatricals. Always delight me. Working for them, I mean. For Romeo and Juliet, there will be a lot of work, if you're going to do it seriously at all. We'll have to get your housekeeper's friend to help with the actual sewing, Hilda. It will give her something to do." Hilda had followed all this, pleased, until the last sentence. There she looked aghast. Actually, oh no, she doesn't like sewing, and I'm sure she won't want anything to do with the costumes or the play. With the play, of course not, but why shouldn't the woman make herself useful? After all, she's eating your food. Hilda was very ill at ease. "I imagine your mother would expect her to make herself useful in many little ways if she were here," Miss Grant finished. "Oh no, Mother wouldn't bother her. Mother never bothers anyone." There was a peculiar smile hovering at Hilda's lips now. She seemed amused in spite of her obvious discomfort. "Hebe simply hates sewing, and she's here for a rest anyway." Miss Grant sat back in her chair, looking at Hilda with a special amusement of her own. "You poor defenseless chick," she murmured. "I think I shall have to take you directly under my wing. You need someone to look out for your rights. Did your mother know that this Hebe person, ridiculous name, meant to stay on indefinitely, resting and visiting the cook?" Hilda was looking into her lap. Crystal thought she was wringing her hands down there under the table. "Yes, I guess so. It's all right." "Yes, it probably is, very probably, but just the same, if I were you, when I wrote your mother next, I'd tell her something about it. People do such cheeky things when you give them a chance, sometimes." Hilda looked up at Miss Grant. "I can't bother Mother with anything," she stated. "She's resting too." Miss Grant was very much at home in such a situation. She was born to manage and smooth the lives of other people. She said now, with sincerity and really kind intention, "You dear thing, let me play mother to you and Paul, won't you? Nothing arouses my fighting spirit like cheekiness of that sort, Hebe's I mean, and I am quite capable of dealing with it." Crystal rose with disconcerting suddenness, the legs of her chair screeching along the floor in that so silent house. "Hebe isn't cheeky, not a bit," she said, in a low, trembling voice. "She's a wonderful person. She's a friend of mine, and I've got to go." She couldn't look at Miss Grant or at anyone. Her old enemy had her, the first time in many months. The enemy, of course, was temper, anger. It always frightened and hurt Crystal unspeakably. The experience of anger. She fairly plunged out of the room and down the hall. She had trouble getting the big front door open. She did not know that her eyes were full of tears until she tried to look through them to find out what was wrong with the latch. Dr. Grant, who had followed her from the dining room, touched her elbow. "Gently, gently," he said, in his tired but ever so kind voice. "I'll do it." He opened the door for her. She went past him, out into the hot sunlight, not able even to say "thank you." Yet his words and his voice rang in her mind, a mellow note. Gently, gently. Soon, as she went, the remembered inflections of that tired voice held her inner attention completely. After all, anger had not swallowed her, and Hebe was really so wonderful that she did not need Crystal's anger for defense. Hebe herself wouldn't care what Miss Grant said. Crystal was sure she wouldn't care, and there was another ray of light in Crystal's mind besides that. It was that Hilda, too, had hated it all. Crystal had been looking at her as Miss Grant talked about Hebe, and it was plain as day that Hilda was deeply disturbed. It came to Crystal as a conviction, as she walked, that Hilda herself knew that Hebe was wonderful. Chapter 10. The Bottom Stair. Selina was very nearly as excited as Crystal about Paul's plan for doing Romeo and Juliet up at the Red House. She agreed with Crystal that this was an opportunity to prove her ability, to herself at least, and possibly to prove it to someone else too. If a real producer was to be present, who knows what might not come of it? Yes, Selina was, as she herself had admitted after Hebe's call, young. She was young enough to dream with Crystal and watch for miracles. "You must read some of Juliet's part to me," she said. "We'll just go over and over it until you are so perfect Paul will have to choose you. When you have your tryouts tomorrow, will he let you try any place you like in the play?" Yes, Hilda said so. But oh, Selina, suppose it shouldn't be me. What would I do, Selina? Now was an opportunity for Selina to be sensible for Crystal, to tell her that, if she did fail to get the part, she must not mind too much, to say she must be prepared for that, and to remind her also that ultimately it would prove a very small thing in her life whether she acted Juliet this summer or not. She thought of saying all this, but it got no farther than thinking. Since that hour of Hebe's visit, Selina had not been quite so sure of herself as of old. Things that would have seemed sensible and true then were no longer so clear-cut in their justness. What Hebe had really done was to shake Selina's faith in Selina's maturity. Since the talk with Hebe, and perhaps more than the talk, the silences of Hebe, Selina had dropped more and more her Sibyl mask. So instead of being sensible for Crystal now, she merely said gravely, "I don't know what you'd do. You've got to get that part, that's all. No one else cares about it so much as you, so you've got to get it." That afternoon, Selina had promised to go autoing with one of her beaux, a young man from Cummington, home from Yale for the summer holidays, and now it was time for lunch, so the rehearsing must be put off until that night. But we'll give the whole evening to it, she assured Crystal. If anyone drops in, we'll simply tell 'em we're busy. Selina was sitting on the bottom stair, again in the hall's dusk, a seat she had often taken since Hebe's call. Now Crystal knelt by her and shyly kissed her hair. She had always adored Selina, of course. No one could possibly help adoring her. Witness Selina's numerous beaux and her devoted women friends, young and old. But lately, Crystal had felt a special loveliness about her, a dearer dearness. Was that due to the new season that Hebe had ushered in for Crystal? Or had a new season, perhaps, come to Selina herself? The rehearsal began that evening at 8 o'clock. Selina, as audience, was throned in the middle of the parlor sofa, in her hands the last section of the guest room curtains. Crystal stood on the hearth rug, her fingers fluttering the pages of a little red book. Are you ready? Ready. You'll be honest and tell me if I'm too bad. Stop me and I'll begin all over again. Crystal was trembling, as though it were chilly, and her cheeks had the pallor that Selina knew meant extreme excitement with her. For an instant, Selina entertained the morbid fancy that Crystal's dark eyes had grown wider and darker until they filled the room, that she, Selina, might slip forward into the dark pool they made unless she took up her needle and went on with her hemming. Such fancies were unusual with Selina. She was impatient of this one. Do light the lamp, Crystal, before you begin. Then you can see your book, and I can see my work. No, let's have it like this. Don't so, Selina. Give all your attention to me. But you'll strain your eyes. I know it very nearly by heart, no matter about my eyes. Selina moved to the corner of the sofa, and putting her work down beside her, clasped her hands about her knees. All right, Miss Have It Your Own Way. Shoot, she said. Both girls laughed at such an expression on Selina's careful lips. And as they laughed, Selina realized that there was no dark, dangerous pool before her into which she might slip, but only her little sister's friendly, clear eyes. Nothing could drown in their clarity. That was better, and they were ready now. Crystal drew the fireside bench toward her and sat on its end. This is my bed, she explained, and this is the phial of poison. She held up the little red book. I know this scene by heart, and I think it's a good one to use for Paul, don't you? If I can do this, which is the hardest of all, then he'll know I can do all the others. You're right about that. Do you remember Victoria Gildersleeve in it? Even in the pictures, you felt the terrible words, didn't you? Do you know, I'm glad she's not to come to see it. Really, Imagine daring to say one word of Juliet's before her. It would be, too, just plain funny. I can see that. But is Mr. Gildersleeve going to be any easier? He directed her in that, you know, and in everything according to Hilda. Yes, I think he'll be much easier. After all, he didn't play the part himself. He couldn't feel so terribly to have it going all wrong, as Juliet, I mean, Victoria would. It's not going to be going all wrong, but of course it won't be Victoria. Let's begin. Farewell. God knows when we shall meet again. I have a faint cold. Fear thrills through my veins. That almost freezes up the heat of life. Crystal went on through the whole long, overtaxing speech. Romeo, I come. This do I drink to thee, she ended, sinking down upon the fire bench. Selina said nothing for a time, while Crystal rested. Finally her comment came. It's too big a speech, too big for anyone but a very great actress. But you made me shiver just the same. It's as though you knew about it, as though you were terrified, as Juliet was terrified. I suppose she was young like you, Crystal. That makes it all the more pitiful and awful. I'm sure no one will be better or anywhere near so good tomorrow. Anyway, doing it again won't help any. You've been working at it hard, haven't you? All afternoon, most. Crystal sighed and bowed her head upon her knees. She was very tired. Selina succeeded in persuading her to go to bed, but sensibly in bed, Crystal could not sleep. How could she sleep when tomorrow, ahead of her there at 3 o'clock, up at the Red House, the tryouts were to come off? She must do Juliet's vile scene so well, so convincingly, that there would be no question in Paul's mind that she ought to have the part. But if she shouldn't, if Agnes or someone else should be better. Selina went to bed much later, in the middle of the night, toward dawn rather. She was awakened, but not suddenly. It was a gentle waking, as though something had been troubling her sleep for a long time, without actually breaking it. She turned on her back and listened. Yes, no wonder. Someone was talking, and near too, not out on the street, or in the house next door, nearer than that. Was it a human voice talking, or just the voice of the night itself, the summer starry night? Selina was not quite wide awake yet. Sleepily, she raised herself on an arm and listened, trying to come quite awake. Crystal's voice. Heavens, the child must be talking in her sleep. No, it didn't seem to be coming from Crystal's room, beside her own, at the head of the stairs. Her door was closed, and it wouldn't sound like that if Crystal were murmuring in her sleep, in her bed there, with the wall between. The voice sounded from the air, at Selina's very window. Now that it was located, Selina was startled. Was Crystal sleepwalking on the sloping roof of the gable? Selina was wide enough awake now. She sped to the window and knelt there looking out. Thou knowest the mask of night is on my face. Else would a maiden blush repaint my cheek, for that which thou hast heard me speak tonight." The next instant, Selina was standing in her sister's room. Yes, Crystal was kneeling in her own dormer, leaning out into the night, lost in the balcony scene from Romeo and Juliet. But she was making it so real that Selina almost sensed a Romeo below in the pansy bed. She hoped he had put his feet down with some discretion for the sake of her precious yellow and purple pansies. This half-conscious anxiety of Selina's about the fate of her pansies proved, without a doubt, that Crystal was doing the scene well. Selina let her finish, and then she quite needlessly asked, "Crystal Barker, what are you doing? Haven't you been to sleep yet? This is dreadful, and what will the neighbors think?" But Crystal was not thinking of the neighbors. "Do you know," she said, as Selina marched her toward the bed, holding her by the wrist, "I think I'd better do the balcony scene tomorrow instead of the file scene. No one like me could do the file scene. It's silly to try. Perhaps Paul will let it be cut. He ought to, if he has any sense about it. I've been thinking, how much did you hear, Selina? Do wait, and let me go through it all for you." But Selina would not listen. "You're a silly little girl," she proclaimed, really vexed, "and don't get out of bed again tonight. I told you to forget about the tryouts. You'll be sick if you act like this, and lose your chance altogether. Good night." But it's nearer morning. Crystal, with her peculiar childlike patience and obedience, did lie stilly, trying to go to sleep, her lids down fast, but sleep would not obey. Sleep is a subtle spirit, and not to be taken by such obvious measures. Soon she heard her door opening. Selina had come back. She knelt down by the bed, putting her smooth, cool cheek to her sister's hot one. "Darling, don't worry," she whispered. "I think you're perfectly right. The balcony scene is light and gay, and lets you laugh in spite of its great tenderness and beauty. You did it beautifully. Do you know, I was afraid your Romeo was spoiling my pansies down there under the window. All the while, her cool cheek was making Crystal's cool. Wasn't that funny of me? But that must be real acting, Crystal." In the morning, Crystal did not remember when Selina had left her, or that she had left her at all, for sleep had responded to those more delicate measures, and overwhelmed the exhausted Crystal before she was conscious of its approach. Chapter 11. Tryouts. Crystal arrived at the Red House 1 minute before 3. The front door stood wide open. Agnes, who was with her, said they need not bother to ring. From a window above their heads came the buzz and laughter that always goes with a meeting of the sort that was there. It excited the girls and hurried their entrance. A bench that ran half the length of the hall, under a long mirror, was flowery with summer hats, all of them belonging to Juliet. Agnes said, winking at Crystal as they ascended the stairs, and before Crystal, whose sense of humor was not particularly alive today, could take this in and respond with a laugh, she went on, "Tryouts are to be in Victoria Gildersleeve's room, that is, the room that was to have been hers if she had come. It was 3 doors down the upper hall. The girls were welcomed with acclaim, for their appearance meant that every single soul on Paul's list had come, and on time, as he had commanded. But what a metamorphosis had taken place in the Cookie Bird Hamlet Paul, Crystal's private name for him. He looked older today, but it was more than that. His luminous eyes had lost their remoteness. They centered themselves intently on each and every one to whom they were directed, and he moved with an alert, tigerish quickness. "Hello, glad you're here," he said briskly, with a short nod to them. He turned to the others. "Silence," he ordered. "Everyone take chairs in the back of the room now." It was a big room, entirely empty of furniture, except for the rows of chairs at one end, placed as in a theater. The stage, an oblong blue rug, faced the windows. If this had the disadvantage of making it more difficult for the future actresses and actors to read in their books, it was compensated for by giving Paul the fullest opportunity to judge of faces and types. It was amazing that once seated, the 12 boys and girls fell as silent as though it were church. All eyes rested on Paul. In the silence, he paced a few times, back and forth, on the blue stage, his hands clasped behind his back, his head first down, then tossed suddenly up, as though thinking with it so came easier. His audience took it all quite seriously, as indeed they had a right to. Paul was perfectly sincere, and not attitudinizing in the least. He was preparing himself for a feat of complete concentration and judgment. Midway of the stage, on about his 9th turn, he whirled abruptly on the bated breathers. "Crystal Barker," he demanded, "what are you prepared to try for?" Crystal stood up as though she were in school. "Juliet," she said, meekly and softly. "Very well. What scene?" "The balcony scene." "Very well. Begin." He moved from the stage, indicating that it was now hers. Between the short rows of chairs, an aisle had been left. Paul transferred his pacings to this aisle. He backed up it and came down it, springingly on his toes, like an impatient tiger, his hands still behind him, the posture of his head varying between very low, with his eyes looking up under his brows, and very high, with his eyes looking down over his aristocratic nose. He was as impressive as though he had been in the profession for 20 years, and his word, success or failure, to the aspiring ones. Crystal quaked, as indeed all who came after her were to quake. But with those who came after, it was different rather. For them, the trial meant simply a trial for this play, an amateur play to be put on for fun this summer. With Crystal it meant much more, or she felt it meant much more. She was on trial for a whole career. Her future hung in the balance. No wonder the hands holding the little red book shook, so that she could not see the number of the pages. This sense in Crystal of the importance of the thing pleased Paul in a way, but it irritated him too. Begin, he commanded. What edition is that? Rolf's? And you want the balcony scene? Page 63, the bottom of the page. Begin. This was amazing. Did Paul know the number of the pages of any place in the play in all the editions of the thing? This was almost omnipotence. Crystal ceased to flutter the leaves. She knew it by heart anyway. She began, "Ah me." Ah me indeed, poor Crystal. Halfway through the scene, Paul stopped her. "That'll do. Rotten. Take your seat and try later for something else." He was justified. Crystal had merely been murmuring words. She was choked by stage fright, but she did not obey the director and take her seat to try again later for another part. She turned in the other direction and went out the door. Paul shouted after her, but she paid no attention. She shut the door behind her ever so softly and stood still outside, her head bowed. She heard Paul take up the trials again. Agnes next. "What part are you trying?" She did not hear Agnes's reply, but she knew it, of course. "Juliet." "Go up then. Ready, begin." She followed Agnes all through the balcony scene, but the voice did not sound like Agnes's really. It had such a sure clarity and finish, and it had range, not only in scale, but in quality. It wasn't Juliet's voice, of course. Juliet's voice would be lighter, more careless, almost like bird notes in the dawn in places. Crystal could not see Juliet through Agnes's tone, leaning at her balcony, reaching down to Romeo. Yet she knew that Agnes was reading beautifully, in a trained way. Was that Miss Putnam's school, or her mother, Miss Grant's tutoring? For this, while at the door, standing like a sleeping statue, with head bowed, Crystal hardly grieved for her own failure. It was Juliet's loss that hurt her. Juliet herself was being badly treated, being stolen from. This was while Crystal was still numb, but as Agnes finished, she remembered her own disgrace. How ridiculous she had made herself. They all knew, everyone in there knew, that she had thought she could act, that she meant to be an actress. And now, what of the career? Everything was lost. Crystal heard a movement in a room across the hall. She crossed and stood in the open door. Bianca was there, lifting books out of a big box by the windows and piling them beside her on the floor. They were new books, still in their fresh and often gaudy jackets. It must be Hilda's room. It was so pretty. There were peach-colored muslin curtains at the 4 big windows. They went beautifully with the apple-green furniture and the big square of gray matting on the painted floor. A bright orange dressing gown was thrown over a chair back, and bright orange satin mules had been kicked about the floor. The new books were destined for the empty built-in shelves below the windows. Bianca felt Crystal's presence at the door and straightened, looking at her inquiringly. She noticed nothing peculiar about Crystal until she spoke. Then the huskiness of the voice, more than Crystal's actual words, surprised her. "I've got to see Hebe," the husky voice said. "Where is she?" Bianca shook her head. There was a definite finality about the gesture. "She is resting. Any message to her I will deliver for you later." She spoke carefully, pronouncing the English words with almost no accent. It sounded like a speech thoroughly learned and perhaps many times repeated. Crystal turned from the door and vanished like a spectre, as silently as she had appeared. But she did not go toward the stairs. She went on down the hall until it turned, a sharp right-angle turn. What a big house the red house really was. Beyond the turn, the hall was cut by a passageway, too narrow to be called a hall, but it was long. Light from a window at its farthest end turned the dust motes in the air to dancing gold. Crystal moved on through the series of golden screens they made. A woman's figure came toward her, a moving blot against the brightness. The light was behind her, and Crystal could not distinguish her features. But she was wearing a white cap, and so she must be one of the maids. They met midway of the passage, and Crystal said, as she had said to Bianca a few seconds ago, "I've got to see Hebe. Where is she?" The maid was a young woman with a nice face. Now that Crystal could see it, she looked at Crystal with a special curiosity, but she shook her head as Bianca had shaken her head, and repeated Bianca's very words. "She is resting. Any message to her I will deliver later." She sounded like a parrot, but her eyes were kind. Crystal was standing by a step up into a room with a closed door. Wearily she sat down on the step and waited while the maid went away. She bent her head to her knees. A cool draught blew from the distant window across her bowed head, bringing comfort. The maid must have gone on into some room nearby, for Crystal heard a door close. In spite of Bianca, and in spite of this other servant, whom Crystal had never seen before, but who had nice eyes, she meant to go on and find Hebe. She had to find Hebe. Someone touched her shoulder. She looked up expectantly. Hebe had come to her, she thought. But no, it was just another person in a cap. This maid was not so young as the last one, and her glance was merely inquisitive. She had sharp features and an edge to her voice. "Can I do nothing for you?" she asked. "You are in the way of the door." So it was her room, and she wanted to go in. But Crystal's thoughts came too slowly for her to move at once. "Where is Hebe?" she asked for the third time. "I've got to see her." The maid, Nina, put her hands on her hips and surveyed Crystal from head to foot with curious eyes. Sitting like that, Crystal looked much younger than she really was. In fact, she looked like a long-legged child. Well, almost any audience was good enough for Nina's irritation, even this child. Indeed, she felt that Crystal was exactly the opportunity she needed. She began speaking, and she did not stop until she had said just everything she had been wanting to say to somebody, to anybody, for days. Bianca, that's the housekeeper, or cook, or whatever you want to call her, but a funny one, whatever it is, says Miss Heaves not to be disturbed. We're all to move around here on tiptoes. Miss Heaves mustn't hear us. Miss, mind you, why should she be missed any more than me, or than Rose, or than Bianca herself? Judge if you can. It's too deep for me. Mighty soft she's having it here, that Miss Heaves, resting. Nothing but resting, and nobody can speak to her or go near. Shelling a few peas I don't call anything, or even making a prune whip yesterday. That's just play. And anyway, all that sort of help is for Bianca. What does she do to make things easier for Rose and me? She never lifts her finger for us, that's truth. She'd not be likely to, not the likes of her. And yesterday she went off and left her bed unmade, all tumbled, and she hadn't even hung up her dressing gown. A funny dressing gown it was, too. Bianca said she'd forgotten, said she'd gone out to see the dawn, or something, and forgot the bed. "Huh," she said to me, "you make the room up." I said, "No, indeed, I won't, not me." Rose, with her soft heart, piped up and said she'd be glad to. Talk about spoilin'. And Rose, with more to do than she has time for. I read her a lecture afterwards, a good one, but she turned a deaf ear. Well, that's her affair. Rose is too soft. You'll hardly believe that Miss Heaves has breakfast in bed most every day, but she does. Bianca takes 'em to her, rolls, and coffee, and orange juice, and an egg, sometimes 2 eggs. That's Bianca's affair, though. If she wants to do it, all right, but let her ask me to do it one morning. She'd find where I stand. If it wasn't that Bianca had hired me herself, and if the whole house here hadn't been given up to her to do just exactly what she pleases with, I'd write to Miss Gildersleeve, I would, and tell her the queer doings. But where's the good? I'd get fired for my pains most like. And anyway, I'm not one to make trouble of that sort. But a funny mother that actress is, and it makes no difference that she's who she is. Her children are her first duty, I say, and her house, at least to know how it's being run, and what strange people are in it, eating her food, and being waited on like ladies. Don't you think yourself it's queer? Rose, nor any of 'em won't say nothing, so I ask you. Yes, it's queer, but Crystal had scarcely heard a word, and those she had heard had meant nothing to her understanding. She stood up. I've got to see her. Nina pointed down the passageway. Well, if you've got to, she's out there over the bridge, in the top of the garden house. But mind you, Bianca says she's not to be disturbed. I've only told you where she is. If you disturb her, that's your affair. not mine, isn't it?" Nina went up into her room and shut the door abruptly, but as softly as Bianca could have wished. Crystal walked down to the end of the passage. A narrow door stood open there onto a bridge of the same width, connecting the house with one of the garden sheds. Across that bridge, behind the unpainted door, there in the upper story of the garden house, she would find Hebe. Ordinarily, Crystal would be the last one in the world to intrude on a person who had left directions that she was not to be disturbed. But in this hour, nothing was at all ordinary with Crystal. She was numbed and almost sleepwalking. She must get to Hebe to be waked to life again. So she crossed the bridge and knocked on the door. For an appreciable instant after the knock there was silence. Then Hebe's voice, with a note of surprise in it, said, "Come in." It was as though Crystal had stepped into a room in the fields. It smelled of white clover, red clover, and grass with the sun on it, and there was a breeze. Hebe was lying on a small bed, her head to the door, her position kitty corner, with a broad window open upon the fields. She was wearing a white wool robe, with long, loose sleeves, like a monk's. That was the funny dressing gown mentioned by Nina. Her hair was spread out on the pillow fan-wise, rippling and tarnished brown. Her feet were bare, except for sandals of an ancient pattern, fashioned of such soft white kid that they seemed made of silk. Crystal noticed the bare white feet first, and thought how marble white they were, like a statue's or a goddess's. She was standing where Hebe would need to turn her head to see her. But Hebe did not turn her head. She lay waiting. However, when Crystal remained silent, too, and did not move into her line of vision, finally she raised herself on her arm and slowly looked around. When she saw that it was Crystal, she brought her feet to the floor and sat on the edge of her bed, an inquiring look on her face. Crystal rushed to her and knelt by her side. Hebe steadied the emotions that were now ready to burst like a thunderstorm over Crystal by a touch of her hand on Crystal's head and another on her shoulder. "My dear child, what is it?" she asked. "What is the matter?" Crystal sat back on the floor, wide awake again, and the storm avoided. Like so many a New England thunderstorm, it had just gone around. Hebe's clear tone had been the wind that turned the black clouds. "Forgive me for coming when they told me not to, when Bianca told me not to," Crystal begged. "How can I tell you why it was I had to?" "Don't bother about telling me why you had to come. Only tell me now what has happened." But when she was told, Hebe did not understand. It was very difficult to realize what it meant to Crystal to have failed in the tryouts. It was disappointing, of course, but then someone had to be disappointed. Everyone couldn't be Juliet. there must be ladies for the ballroom and street scenes, and for the mother and the nurse. It would be pleasant to be leading lady, of course, to do Juliet, but was it worth the stricken expression on Crystal's face? Crystal tried to explain further. Hadn't she told Hebe that day on Long Hill that she wanted to be an actress? Well, today had been the opportunity for the first step, and she had failed. Yes, Hebe remembered that Crystal had said something about wanting to be an actress that day as they went up Long Hill, but she had not taken it very seriously. Most young girls do go through that phase sometime in the course of their growing up, only they don't take it so hard as all this. Crystal must get perspective on what had happened. She must be reasonable. But Crystal, sitting there on the floor at Hebe's knees, put her hands on the top of Hebe's hands, stopping her. "I am different from all those girls you are talking about," she said, with such conviction that Hebe had to believe her. "With me, acting is to be the greatest thing in life, just as it is with Victoria Gildersleeve. Nothing else matters. I'd give up everything else for it. I'd be poor and hungry and have no one to love me, anything, if only I could be an actress. Don't you see?" Hebe began to see, but only a glimmer of the whole truth. She said little more, and that little was simply to help Crystal go on explaining. Crystal told about that time 2 years ago when she had seen Victoria Gildersleeve in Juliet in the pictures. She told of the conviction that had come to her that night that she herself must be an actress. Then she told about her father. She even told how he had failed and perhaps died of heartbreak more than typhoid. After that hour, Hebe knew the strength of Crystal's intention as surely as Selina herself did. Selina, who for months and months had encountered it hourly in Crystal. But Hebe wanted to know more. She wanted to know whether Crystal had talent as well as intention. She said, finally, "Let me hear you do the balcony scene. Stand over there by the table, behind it. Use it for the balcony rail." Hebe lay back on the bed, her arms behind her head, but so propped that she could see Crystal. Crystal put her hand on the table and leaned out, looking into the garden's night. "Ah me," Romeo below said softly. "She speaks. Oh, speak again, bright angel." And all his speech, it was Hebe, of course. She said the words almost tonelessly, as impersonally as the wind blows, simply as a help to the scene and Crystal did not wonder at her knowing the words. Not then. Later she did a little. Together, Hebe lying on her bed, Crystal behind the table, they went through the long scene. Hebe uttered the last couplet in response to Crystal's with her eyes closed. "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast. Would I were sleep and peace, so sweet to rest." Then she stayed silent without opening them, but Crystal had no care. Between them, the balcony, the garden, the night, and the lovers had come to life. All the lost color was back in Crystal's face. but she was unprepared for the curious brightness of Hebe's eyes when finally she opened them. The balcony scene enacted here in the little room over the garden house had persuaded Hebe, as no words ever could have, that with Crystal the acting craze was not a craze at all. It was a genuine ambition that must be respected. But her words were moderate. "Your voice needs a good deal of training," she said, "and you overact. But for all that you have done, what even some very fine actors haven't succeeded in doing, you have listened deep in Juliet's mind." She sat up on the edge of the bed again. "It's no wonder you failed in the tryouts," she exclaimed. "You cared altogether too much about it. But next time you won't fail. Paul will surely see that you are capable." "Oh, but there won't be a next time. By now Agnes or someone else has the part, I'm sure. It's all over." Hebe stood up. "What do you mean, it's all over? There won't have been time in these first trials to have cast the whole play, and you must try for the nurse or someone else at next trials." Crystal was dismayed. Play the nurse? Play anything but Juliet? "Of course. Aren't you interested in the production? Don't you want it to be a good one? Don't you mean to throw yourself into it and help all you can, whatever part you're cast for?" No, such an idea had never entered Crystal's head, but with Hebe looking at her like that, with just the shadow of disappointment hovering on Hebe's brow, she suddenly nodded. "Oh, Hebe," she cried, "yes, I do. I'll try again, and I'll work for the play. I'd do anything for you." Hebe went to her dressing table. "But it's not for me," she said. "I have nothing to do with it at all. It's for yourself. In time, you would have come around to doing just that for yourself. If I hadn't said a word, I know." Hebe began to do up her hair. It hung to her waist, rippling and tawny, but when she had wound it up and tucked it in, its lights were lost. It was like a close-fitting, silky cap. She was looking into a mirror nailed above the little dressing table, a mirror hardly a foot square, with a narrow ebony frame. Crystal, meeting her friend's glance in its depths, thought she had never seen clearer glass. It was almost unearthly in its perfection. Hebe's face there looked like the pale and mysterious face of some fairy person seen in a deep well. "Why did they give you this room?" Crystal asked. "It's so far away from everything, and so small. There are loads of unused and comfortable bedrooms back there." She was thinking of the rooms she had seen as she walked through halls and passages an hour ago or more in search of Hebe. "They gave me this," Hebe assured her, "because I liked it best. It seems to me like part of the fields, not a room at all. When I lie or sit here and look out, I am so near to the grass and the Queen Anne's lace that it seems I'd only have to stretch out my hand to touch them. The door there leads down a short circular staircase, into a cool little round room stacked with flower pots. You know the smell of flower pots in a cool place. I feel my way through and step out directly into the long grass. From there I go any way I please, to the woods, to the stream, to the hills. It is convenient. Crystal looked about thoughtfully, seeing the place really for the first time. Yes, it is the nicest room I was ever in spite of its being almost without furniture, and no pictures except that tree one. She agreed at last. I would choose it too. I'd choose it if only for that mirror. Hebe slipped out of her dressing gown and hung it away behind a curtain. Crystal sat in the one chair in the room, watching her dress. She thought the pearly frock Hebe put on lovely, and said so. But how do you keep it always so clean? She asked. Hebe smiled at her again from the mirror's depth. I am glad you like it, she said, but it's not always the same frock as it looks to be. I have several for the summer, and they're all alike, but you could not tell them apart. I oughtn't to be staying, bothering you while you're dressing, Crystal exclaimed, almost before Hebe had finished her explanation about the dress. I've been horrid, and you were resting. You're all right, Hebe assured her, and isn't this as good a time as any to go for our second sitting on the view? Do you suppose Alexander will be up there at this hour? The light isn't morning light, of course, but we can go for the walk anyway, and then if he's there and wants to paint some, he may. Oh, Hebe, you're so good to me. It doesn't hurt about Juliet now, not anywhere near as it did hurt. Going for a walk with you will take even what's left away. No, it won't quite do that, Hebe said, but throwing yourself into the idea of the play, doing what part Paul does finally give you, and having a general interest in the thing as a whole, will more than make up for the one disappointment of not being Juliet yourself in time. It will be such fun, such an experience. I envy you almost, Crystal. You are so fresh for it. They went down the circular staircase together, Hebe ahead to feel the way. The smell of the stacked flower pots, with their memory of earth and pushing roots, had all the magic Hebe had hinted of it, and one step through a low brick door landed them in the flowering field that was really only a continuation of Hebe's little room. The minute they were out, Hebe put on the silvery gray shade hat she had been swinging in her hand. You must watch the sun, she said to Crystal, absently. Time and I are strangers, and no one will worry about my getting back in any case. But you have Selina. Chapter 12. Miss Grant Wonders. Selina was grateful that Crystal took her loss of the part of Juliet so lightly, for she did seem to be taking it lightly. But Selina found it difficult to understand. It was Hebe who had made her see it sensibly. Selina was aware. Only how had Hebe done it? Crystal couldn't herself tell. It isn't what she says. She thought it out for Selina aloud, that night when she returned from Long Hill, and a second sitting for the portrait to tell Selina that she had failed miserably. It's what she is. Things are different when you are with her, that's all. It's as though you were in a different world, a world where things feel differently. Awful things aren't awful anymore, and some things that might seem nice in the first world, this world, aren't worth so much there. But after all, perhaps it's not so much a new world as a new season in this one. The very first time I saw Hebe and walked with her up from the station, I began to think about a new season. Not spring, summer, autumn, winter, but a different kind of season. A season of the mind, you mean? Yes, I guess so. More than the mind, though. It goes right through. That very evening, following Hebe's advice, Crystal went up to the Red House and asked for a special trial for the nurse's part. As it happened, that was the one vacancy remaining. Yesterday, every other part had been cast. Agnes had got Juliet, and Paul himself Romeo. Crystal was accepted for the old nurse very easily, because this time she read well enough and was perfectly calm. And it's no easy part, remember that, Paul warned her. Many actresses have made their name and fame doing it. You'll have to work hard and not miss a rehearsal, Crystal promised. The next day they plunged into rehearsing. From the first, Paul proved himself a driving tyrant, but no one seemed to mind. In fact, they liked it, and certainly only Paul's autocratic methods would ever have succeeded in making that group of light-hearted, careless boys and girls take the work seriously enough for it to pay. It was a drawback, he felt, that he himself had to do Romeo. Yet there seemed no other way. No one else in the tryouts had proved it all possible. He knew very well that to get the best effect, a producer of a play should not be acting in it, but there was no help for it this time. Though they worked hard at rehearsals, there was plenty of fun along with it. The Red House was a friendly and carefree place. Before the summer was over, all those amateur actors felt as much at home there as in their own houses, and in some cases more so, for it was a house made for boys and girls. The doors were so wide and friendly, the windows were so big and always open, the rooms were so high and large and square, and there was a complete absence of bric-a-brac and nonsense. You could run and shout and whistle as loudly as you pleased, with no one to hush you up. That is, you could if you didn't go near the garden house, connected with the main house by that odd little narrow bridge, or into that long dark hall upstairs in the wing. There Bianca would hush you up with a will. They all had a respect for the Italian woman that amounted almost to awe. Very soon they got used to the idea of steering clear of that wing inside and that garden house outside entirely, and they really felt no loss or restriction, for enough of a playground remained to them for all purposes. The rehearsal room, the room that was to have been Victoria Gildersleeve's if she had come, was the scene of much besides rehearsing. It made a fine place for the boys to practice fencing. Some fencing practice, of course, was necessary for the play, but boxing developed there too, and wrestling matches, in the manner of ancient Greece. When a boy came down on the floor with a loud thump and a cracked head, shaking the chandeliers in the room below, there was no one to complain, and no one to get nervous or faint over the bruises either. And that very room below, where the chandeliers so often shook, was the scene of much gaiety. There, in a generous corner, stood the grand piano that the Gildersleeves had sent from New York. Hilda played jazz with so much spirit that a great deal of dancing was inevitable, and when they got tired of that, sometimes Agnes would play her classical music, and Esther sang little French and Italian songs to her accompaniment. Though, to be truthful, those concerts usually wound up with some such ballad as A Home by the Deep Rolling Sea, with everybody joining in. Outside there were the tennis courts, not one court, mind you, but 3. There as many as were ever likely to want to could be accommodated at one time. In fact, rehearsing once over for the day, the actors were very apt to stay on till the evening. Bianca sometimes invited them all for luncheon. The dining room was as comfortable and friendly as the rest of the house. There was a long table there, which when all the leaves were in, would seat 20 comfortably. A meal in that dining room and of Bianca's planning and cooking was an experience to remember, but with all the fun of it, and the freedom and the companionship, went for everyone an eager interest in the play. Paul's personality was a big enough one to hold them to the work definitely. This is saying a great deal, but the acting was not all there was to the play business, not by any means. Hilda, on her end, got loyal help and attention too, at least that of the more mechanical-minded. The idea of the water curtain was a fascination. Pipes were to be laid from the main plumbing to the stone porch at the side of the house where the play was to be acted, carrying water of such force that when the big pipe that would lie outside the footlights was perforated and the water turned on, a water curtain would result that would reach as high as the second-story windows. After dark, with spotlights playing on it, this water curtain would be a spectacle in itself, almost as good as the play. At least so Hilda thought, and there were those who agreed with her. All this was in Hilda's charge. She commandeered a competent crew of workers of both sexes. They called themselves the stage hands, and Hilda was the electrician and stage manager. The stage, the wide stone porch was ideal for the purpose. It was really very nearly the size of an ordinary stage in a New York theater. At the back, there were 2 doors into the house, furnishing entrances and exits, and above there was a little balcony with a door, exactly the thing for the balcony scene. Architecturally, the stone porch and the balcony, perhaps, were not particularly admirable, but for the purpose of this play they could not be bettered. The audience was to be seated on a gradually elevated platform in comfortable chairs with arms. The red house was overflowing with just the chairs for the purpose, and what more were needed could be borrowed. All this, too, was Hilda's affair, and Hilda's idea. She insisted that half the success of the production would depend on the comfort of the audience. She had seen enough amateur theatricals to know, if you had to crane to see a play and to hear it, or if the lights were too dim, or if your chair backs had a wrong slant, or if you were crowded, you simply couldn't be expected to know whether the play was well done or not, but you would be pretty certain to think it was badly done. Paul, it appeared, was very little interested in the audience, their comfort, or their thoughts. With him, the play was the thing. It was fortunate for Hilda's designs that she, in her own way, won as much cooperation from the workers as he did in his. As for the mothers in Fairfleet, they raised their voices in a paean of praise for the whole affair. Their young people were having the most delightful summer of their lives. The Red House and its environs were proving a delightful playground. Hilda and Paul were friends to be highly approved by anyone, and the whole thing was so worthwhile. They stood ready to help in any way they were to be allowed, these delighted mothers, but really, so far, there was nothing for them to do. The girls and boys wanted to be on their own with this undertaking. They wanted to have the satisfaction of putting it through in almost a professional way. But since before they were quite done, a good deal of money was to be spent, it was decided to make Miss Grant, who was the most interested of all the interested mothers, chairman of the costume committee. Miss Gildersleeve, Victoria, had written, offering to pay for materials, and she had said they might be silks and velvets of the best, if discretion was used. So Miss Grant was appointed chairman, and she suggested that she take the other members to Boston for a 2 days trip, going in the doctor's automobile and staying at a hotel. This in itself was a delightful anticipation for the fortunate members of the little committee. Besides rehearsals and the good times at the Red House, Crystal was seeing something of Hebe. They had been several times to the View, and the portrait was getting done. In fact, Hebe's part in it was quite done. She usually took a book, and not being needed, would lie in the shade reading, or rather pretending to. Really, she hardly read a word. It was evident. She oftener slept, or looked as though she slept. though sometimes her eyes were open and musing over the activities of an insect or bird or flower. Crystal wondered of her whether she could see the flowers grow. She looked as though she might be seeing that. Once Alexander said, "You're like a nice cat, Hebe, but so lazy." Crystal flew to Hebe's defense, but Hebe only smiled. She didn't mind being called a cat. Alexander would rather she minded. He said, "You're very tiresome, Hebe. Don't you ever get ruffled as Crystal and I and the rest of humanity do?" "No," Hebe informed him, "I don't." And strange to say, they believed her. You had to believe Hebe, even though she wouldn't be ruffled if you didn't. Miss Grant's promised picnic to Hunter's Beach had been put off and put off in the interest of the play, but finally the day came. It was a very select picnic, and the uninvited members of the cast and theater staff felt it as such. It was the first time since beginning of rehearsals that anything for the younger set in Fairfleet had not included everybody. That was what the Red House was doing that summer for Fairfleet. It was bringing young people together who otherwise might never have known each other. But the Hunter's Beach Affair, as it was called by the left-outers, was a party for stars only, it appeared. For girls, there were Agnes and Crystal and Hilda, and the girl acting Lady Capulet in the play. For boys, Paul and the boys acting Paris, Mercutio, and Capulet. Esther was left out as being too young, but she joined in the doubles in tennis that were going on up at the Red House, in spite of the absence of host and hostess, and did not feel aggrieved. It took crowding to get them all into the doctor's car, big as it was, but that only added to the hilarity. Miss Grant was really a very nice mother to have. She didn't mind the crowding, and she even offered to let Paul drive. This relinquishing of the wheel rather surprised Agnes. Her mother was being genial. Paul hesitated, only the briefest instant. "You know," he said, coloring, and it was strange for Paul to color. "Mother wouldn't let me have my car this summer because I had an accident this spring, driving. She says I'm really too absent-minded. Will you take your chance with that?" Miss Grant agreed too, but she couldn't help adding, "Only don't get absent-minded today, will you?" It was a gay party, except for Paul, who, from the minute he took the wheel, was absolutely silent. He was having the best time of all, though. He was driving the big 6-cylinder with the same eagerness and fire with which he drove his actors in rehearsals. His hair, which needed cutting, blew back from his forehead. His white teeth showed themselves in a continuous half-grin, and his profile sang. Crystal felt that it sang. In the driver's seat, Miss Grant had allowed only 2 people, and given Paul the choice of his companion. He chose Crystal. Perhaps that was because he knew she would not chatter. Miss Grant, back in the crowded tonneau, looked at the back of Crystal's head reflectively and meditated, even while she entered heartily into the lively conversation all around her. I wish I could get to the bottom of what's in Madame Coldwater's mind about Crystal and Selina, she was thinking. There's something there, definite and real and of importance to Madame Coldwater. She says she doesn't know them, and at the same time she is certainly interested in them, and there was a reason for her not inviting them to the lawn party. That omission was very marked. I don't believe it's Selina she objects to, though. It is Crystal. Miss Grant had grounds for this conclusion. Yesterday, her friend had taken her for another drive, and of her own accord she had spoken of Crystal. It happened as they were passing Tinklebell, with Crystal reading in the arbor. What were her words? Miss Grant recalled them exactly. Crystal Barker looks like a gypsy. I wonder if she is as gypsy inside as out. Why doesn't she take more pains with her hair? Miss Grant looked at the troublesome hair now. Crystal was bareheaded, and her locks were certainly blown about. Miss Grant had agreed with Madame Coldwater that Crystal looked gypsyish, and commented on the contrast it was to Selina's blonde loveliness. But Miss Grant turned from Selina. Apparently Selina was not on her mind at all. It was Crystal. What is going to be done with the girl, she had asked. College. Possibly, if Selina can manage it for her. They haven't much money. $1,500 a year, I believe, and the house. But Crystal herself has her heart set on becoming an actress. Miss Coldwater's comment on that had finished the conversation in that direction. Really, she said, with what sounded like cold contempt, just keeping within the boundaries of a well-bred restraint. Yes, I suppose she would. Now, what did that mean? Yes, I suppose she would. It meant, if it meant nothing else, that Madame Coldwater had some information about Crystal that she did not disclose, and a special interest in her. They were nearing Hunter's Beach, the gray cliffs, with the white sea-horses charging against their bases, surprised Hilda into a cry of appreciation. "Oh, it's as good as California," she cried. She repeated it several times. And this, child of California that she was the very greatest compliment she could pay this New England bit of coast. Soon she was stretching to her full height on the tallest cliff of all, the salt, sea-sprayed wind whipping her dress about her like a sheet. It's glorious, glorious, isn't it? And here's the place we always spread the lunch, right here, around this rock. It's flat and protected from the wind. They all followed Miss Grant. There, isn't this love? But their hostess never finished the word. She stopped and appeared to freeze. Also, she appeared to grow taller. The reason was in plain sight. In that protected place, her back to the booming surf, her face to the rock, the housekeeper's friend, Hebe, lay with a white mull scarf rolled into a pillow for her cheek. She was fast asleep.